Investment or exploitation? China wants to boost economic ties with Africa. It's already the continent's biggest trading partner. But who stands to gain the most? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. China is investing billions of dollars in Africa in what it says is a relationship based on equality and mutual benefit. But Beijing's being accused of exploiting Africa's vast mineral and energy resources at the expense of local people. China's Premier Li Keqiang is making his first visit to Africa since taking office last year. The week-long trip will take in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Angola and Kenya. And Li has dismissed talk of any problems as just growing pains and isolated incidents. Well, Li also called on Chinese companies to shoulder due responsibility for local communities in Africa and the environment, and added, "I wish to assure our African friends in all seriousness that China will never pursue a colonialist path like some countries did, or allow colonialism which belongs to the past to reappear in Africa." Well, we have guests in both China, in Africa and in the UK. Let's bring them in now. First of all, from Beijing, we're joined by Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies. Joining us from Nairobi, Joseph Onjala, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. And from London, we have James Schneider, editor of Think Africa Press. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Joseph Onjala, is China only interested in exploiting Africa's vast mineral and energy resources? Is everything else just cosmetic dressing?
Well, that is an issue which has been debated for quite a while now. And I think in the last decade, we have seen a lot of debates, not at the grassroots level, but among scholars, among intellectuals, and at the international platform on whether the China was genuine in its commitment to help Africa develop. But recent events have suggested that the cooperation between China and Africa is not necessarily without pitfalls. And over the media, we have seen, many cases of the Chinese, conduct, either in environmental, circles. We have seen, wildlife losses that, involve Chinese, and we have seen, labor, issues involving the Chinese. And I think there could be an attempt by the Chinese to try and reassure Africa that what is happening that is negative is really not the major focus of this cooperation.
Victor Gao, Premier Li says the relationship with African trading partners is based on equality and mutual benefit, but is it?
Well, first of all, from the Chinese perspective, Africa is important both politically and economically. Now, on the political front, China treats all the African countries as equals, regardless of their sizes, regardless of whether they have resources or not, and regardless how much is their bilateral trade with China. On the economic front, of course, China has been investing in Africa for many decades, and this is way before many European or other developed countries have come back to Africa. Africa, for many of the Western countries, has been the forgotten continent for many decades. And also, I would say, countries like the United States and many European countries have the historical liability because they either have colonized Africa before or have practiced the slavery of the Negro people in their own country. Whereas in China's case, we do not have such historical liability. And I think it is always the case that China wants to engage every African country as an equal. And from our perspective, to respect the African people and African countries on an equal basis is the fundamental basis of our relations with African countries. On the economic front, of course, China is now the second largest economy in the world, And China is the largest trading partner with more than 125 countries in the world. And this is why China's trade with Africa is booming. And I would say China has not only just traded with Africa, China has made huge investment in infrastructure with many African countries. And I think the record overall will speak for itself. There will be many criticisms from European countries or United States, but from the Chinese perspective, we think these criticisms are mostly with prejudices and with another agenda behind it. I think the taste of the pudding is the taste of the pudding is in tasting it. So I think it's up to the African people to decide, what kind of investment they want. If they want to work with the Chinese, we'll be very happy with that.
All right.
But if the European countries or American countries want to make investment in Africa, the more the better. I think the more we invest to help the Africans to engage with each other as trading partners, the better.
Okay, two points I want to put to James Schneider there from what Victor Gao was just saying. James, China may see individual nations in Africa as equals. Nonetheless, Africa as a whole is the weaker partner in this arrangement, isn't it?
Yes, the continent is. Now, that doesn't mean that China is operating in ways which are worse than other external economic actors operating on the continent. In fact, China is probably quite a lot better than Western countries, for example. But clearly, the structural economic relationship is one of, broadly speaking, resources coming out of the African continent and then finished goods or machinery to aid with the extraction of those resources coming in. Now, China does its infrastructural investment, which is the largest of any outside body. In 2012, it was 13 billion. The next largest was the World Bank with just over 4 billion. So it's much more committed to infrastructure development than any other outside actor. And some of this infrastructure development does not just focus on the extraction of resources, but a large amount of it does, and it privileges that kind of structural economic engagement, which, whilst it may in the short term make parts of Africa, some Africans, or even the whole continent a bit richer, the fundamental power dynamic and power imbalance is not undermined.
All right, we've heard from all three of our guests. We'll continue our conversation in just a moment. But first, I want to take a look at some of the numbers here that we're talking about. Bilateral trade between China and Africa stood at just $11 billion in the year 2000. But by 2006, that had jumped to nearly $60 billion. But look at this. Last year, bilateral trade had soared to some $210 billion. Now, Chinese investment in African nations has also risen some 30-fold in the past 10 years. Foreign direct investment went from $500 million in 2003 to almost $15 billion by 2012. And last year, China pledged $20 billion in loans for infrastructure development. Beijing has also been accused of holding back the continent's economic development by focusing on the pursuit of raw materials. By 2010, minerals and other natural resources constituted 80% of all African exports to China. In return, Africa imported technology and other processed materials from China. James, to what extent is China holding back the continent's economic development by focusing on this pursuit of raw materials rather than the creation of local jobs and markets?
I mean, whilst that is true, I think it's unfair to say that China is holding back the continent, because that mode of economic engagement with the continent is mirrored by the rest of the world as well. And actually, China does engage more thoroughly with local governments, asking them what sort of infrastructure it is that they want, and they are more engaged with bringing out individual countries' development plans, which are often focused around this kind of economic structure, which is exporting raw materials, often unprocessed. But, I mean, yes, fundamentally, the basis of much of China's investment into the African continent is very capital intensive. And we know that Africa is desperately requires many, many more jobs. And in order to have broad-based development, you need to have much more labour absorption, because then you can have more domestic demand and more investment into manufacturing that serves both a domestic and then also an external market. So it's unfair to particularly single out China as being a bad actor in this game. They're not. The Chinese are, in general, better than other actors. But it is true that the fundamental economic structures which they're engaging in and also enhancing do intensify this problem.
Joseph, do you agree with that? Has the influx of Chinese companies who bring their own workers deprived Africans of jobs in their own countries? In what way have Chinese companies treated African workers unfairly?
Well, I think let me start by, first of all, commenting on the issue of the foreign direct investment of the Chinese in Africa. I think so far, the kind of investment that we have seen is skewed towards infrastructure, and where, the Chinese firms have won contracts, through international, bidding, and they are engaged, in the construction of roads, railway lines, and power, stations in many parts of Africa. And in addition, we have had, the aid that is tied so that, the Chinese firms are able to directly participate in the kind of investments that arise from the aid, related projects. Now, the flip side of the trading, engagement is that the extraction of, raw materials from Africa for export does, deny Africa, an opportunity to process these raw materials or even manufacture them. And I think so far the African countries have not really been able to leverage their way into, compelling or inducing Chinese investment into the manufacturing or processing of many of these raw materials. So to that extent, we lose all the job creation opportunities to China, because the jobs are eventually created in China and not in Africa. Now, again, on the FDI, many of the firms that participate in the infrastructure sector are, culprits to a lot of ills, and these have been complaints raised over the years that, they do not provide fair, employment terms to the local, workers, and many of them also engage in illegal, activities on the sides.
Okay, Victor Gao, we heard from James Schneider a few moments ago that China isn't a rogue actor here. Tell us something about how China views its responsibility as an investor to ensure that money it's pumping into economies in Africa creates jobs, protects and improves the communities in which it operates, and also doesn't harm the environment.
Well, allow me to make a couple of points. One is that if we look at China with many other countries, for example, China and Australia. China is a big investor in Australia, and China is the largest importer of many resources from Australia. Nobody is accusing China of practicing, all these bad things in Australia or depriving Australians of their jobs. Why? Because they use another measurement to look at the bilateral trade between China and Australia. I think we should use the same measurement to look at China's trade and business relations with Africa. Now, from the Chinese perspective, as a historical liability in Africa, Africa, among all the continents in the world, is the most fragmented. And the intra-Africa infrastructure in terms of the highways, railways, airports, seaports, etc., are very, very minimum. And this is actually one of the key hurdles preventing economic development in Africa to move to a higher level. That's why, from the Chinese perspective, helping the African countries to really beef up their infrastructure in all ways, all forms, especially in bring down this fragmentation throughout the African continent, and to create linkages and the interconnection between various parts of Africa is a key point to help to bring up the economic capability of the African countries. Now, on the Chinese side, China, I think, as one of the other panelists mentioned, is the largest investor in this area, working equally with the African countries to promote the integration in Africa, building up the infrastructure, building up the nation-building capacities of the many African countries. And I think we need to focus on the key points rather than being distracted from, the smaller points.
All right, James, I know you just want to make a quick point, if you can, please.
Yes, Victor's absolutely correct that China does help enormously with infrastructure. And one estimate is that the African continent needs $100 billion each year, and so China has to be a very large part of that. But I think he's also painted a slightly rosy picture of what all of that Chinese infrastructure spending is. A lot of it isn't really linking up different African countries so that trade between African countries and economic activity between African countries can be larger. But a lot of it is, control of a mine, railway from the mine, and then a deep water seaport for expansion. Now, of course, the seaport can be used for other things, but its primary purpose in how it's first coming out is still getting things out.
OK, well, let's just pause there for a moment to take a look at how China's growing influence in Africa can directly affect people's livelihoods. Al Jazeera's Malcolm Webb reports from the Senegalese capital, Dakar.
Modou Gay started learning to make shoes from his grandfather when he was just 5 years old. He even quit school to take over the family's shoemaking business. But since then, his income has halved because instead people are buying shoes made in China.
I talk about it with other shoemakers. What will happen to us and our families 10 years from now? Our job is being attacked.
The shoes cost about $8 for a pair. The profit margin is slim. Modou's shoes feel strong, they're well built, but just around the corner from his shop is a market with thousands of different shoes, all different colours, all different designs, and all of them made in Chinese factories. This one, very similar design, but it doesn't feel nearly as strong. But it only costs about $4, that's about half the price. So it's very difficult for the Senegalese shoemakers to compete. Just across the road, Sidi Sal does a roaring trade selling imported Chinese trinkets and purses. He says he loves China. He even made enough money to fly there for a visit.
If you want to make money, you can only do it with Chinese goods. It's the only way forward. As long as what you sell is beautiful, people will buy it.
As African business booms, China is cashing in. It already overtook the US as Africa's largest trading partner in 2009.
It seems that we have another Cold War between the United States and China.
Political analyst Yoro Dia says China gains advantage in Africa by keeping quiet about democracy and human rights.
China is just saying, I'm here to help you to do business, to do trade. I'm not getting involved in your internal affairs, unlike the US, unlike the UK, unlike the European Union.
As the global economy shifts east, there are winners and losers. Modou's one of thousands of shoemakers in Senegal, and all of them are scared their income and their craft may soon be gone. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Dakar, Senegal.
Joseph Onjala, that's one side of the relationship. How will African nations seek to exploit the relationship with China themselves as that relationship develops?
Well, I think so far the Africans need to move their engagement to the next level, because in the last decade we have seen exports of basically primary commodities and imports of manufactured goods. Now, if Africans want to take this collaboration to the next level, they must create conducive environments for Chinese to invest further in manufacturing in Africa. This has not yet taken place. Many of the products that are imported by Africans can be manufactured locally. Indeed, there is a manufacturing base in Africa that is increasingly getting wiped out. And if for Africa to survive in the next decades, they need to leverage China to invest more so that its manufacturing base is not wiped out eventually. I think Africa needs to find export products beyond the primary commodities. They need to identify the export products that can meaningfully make them gain from the trading engagement.
James, very briefly, to what extent is African economic development dependent upon the health of the Chinese economy?
And I think it is to a reasonably large extent, and there is there's a real task facing a lot of African economies now as the Chinese economy faces a bit more inwards, as labour takes a larger share of the Chinese economy, and domestic consumption becomes a much larger part of its development path. But I don't think that means that China is going to immediately pull up the drawbridge or anything like that. It's a shift that will happen over time. And there is the scope for African governments to work with their Chinese counterparts to bring forward more progressive policies that will improve manufacturing base. I mean, Ethiopia has been starting to do that, and the Chinese are in general more open to these kind of policies, these kind of industrial policies, than their Western counterparts. It's just they aren't being pushed hard enough on them yet.
Well, first stop for the Chinese premier in Africa will be Ethiopia. Here's what Ethiopia's Prime Minister had to say ahead of that visit.
We have to discuss on our regional issues, including regional peace and stability, where China is playing a major role in peace and stability in South Sudan, in Somalia, and also other African countries. So I think we have to work very closely how to make Africa transformed, and as well as Africa pacified.
Victor Gao, is China in Africa for the long haul? How do you see the relationship developing? Does China perhaps have a broader role to play in terms of diplomacy, politics in Africa? Can we expect it to see it playing a greater role in mediating the continent's various conflicts, for example?
Yeah, a couple of points. One is that China is very fast on its way to surpass the United States as the largest economy of the world, in the world. And there are different estimates as to when that will happen, but it's inevitable by now. And the Chinese economy will not just stop there once it surpasses that of the United States. It's still getting bigger. So I would say that in the future, China will depend on, to a more important extent, on its trade relations with Africa. This will be a mutually beneficial win-win situation. Now, on the African side, I would say it is very important to realize that to grow your business, to attract foreign direct investment, to have an environment of peace and stability, rule of law, transparency, all this is very important. And also to have continuity of the strategy for the national development, to emphasize on capacity building, etc. Now, all this will take a lot of efforts, including both domestic efforts as well as international cooperation. And I think in this whole process, in the coming years or even centuries, China will be there as a willing and able partner to cooperate for mutual benefit with Africa. You know, in my personal experience, whenever I see my African friends, I always call them brothers and sisters. And I will treat them like that. And I get treated exactly on the same basis. This is the most important fabric and the foundation of China's relations with Africa.
All right, that begs the question, how does that sit with the US and with the former colonial powers of the EU? But I'm afraid, gentlemen, we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed. In Beijing, Victor Gao. In Nairobi, Joseph Onjala. And in London, James Schneider. And as always, we welcome your thoughts on today's discussion. Add your comments online at facebook.com AJ Inside Story or via Twitter. Just tweet us at AJ Inside Story. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.